Good morning, everybody. Thank you for those who have joined us online. And I also want to thank our panelists who are in various time zones around the world for joining us this morning. My name is Carolina Rossini, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Portulans Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank based in DC with teams in Geneva and Toronto. We are a young organization founded at the end of 2019, and our mission includes informing stakeholders by producing independent, rigorous metrics and database research. You can learn more about it at portulansinstitute.org. I myself, I'm working the ICT and policy and internet and telco environment for over 20 years, both in Brazil, US, and also in Europe. So today I have the honor to host this regional spotlight focus on North America in cooperation with UNESCO and with STL as our 2020 knowledge partner for the Network Readiness Index. Thank you. So this is a 2-hour event divided in 2 segments of 1 hour. The first segment focuses on digital transformation in North America and how the US and Canada can leverage their digital track records to build forward better in a post-COVID world. During the second segment, my colleague and co-founder, Professor Soumitra Dutta from Cornell University will present the recently released Network Readiness Index findings for North America. And we will follow that with a discussion on the results and how COVID might affect those numbers in the future too. So some housekeeping for those who have joined us online this morning. If you are in North America, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A, and I encourage you to send questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. And I encourage you to identify yourself if you want, but also identify the speaker you would like to address your question. I also encourage you to share your thoughts in social media under the hashtag NRI2020 and to follow Portulans in our various channels. We are in YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. Panelists, please mute yourselves when you're not speaking so we don't have any audio interference. So just moving forward to the introductions, I'm very pleased and honored to be joined by Larry Irving. He's an internet pioneer who produced the first empirical study proving the existence of digital divide. He has been at the forefront of global efforts to bridge the digital divide ever since, as the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Communications and Administration of the National Telecoms and Information Administration. Larry also served as the VP for Global Government Affairs at Hewlett Packard, and currently he is the President and CEO of the Irving Group, which provides strategic advice and assistance to ICT companies, foundations, and nonprofits. Dr. Lara Mangrit is the president of Sage Bionetworks, a cutting-edge organization focused on the development and implementation of practice for large-scale collaborative biomedical research. Previously, Lara served as the director of Systems Biology Research Group at Sage, where she helped advance understanding about disease biology and treatment outcomes at the system level. During her career, Lara has advocated for leveraging collaborative, innovative, and digital solutions and platforms to improve medical care. Marie-Pauline Rodil is the director of the UNESCO Liaison Office in New York and serves as the UNESCO representative at United Nations. Marie has worked at UNESCO for over 30 years and formerly served as the head of Liaison Office in Brussels and has the UNESCO representative to the European Union, in addition to developing UNESCO program on youth, human rights, and HIV in cooperation with WHO, World Health Organization. During her career, Marie has established herself as a world-renowned advocate for building closer cultural and education connections to better global communities. Manish Sicha, he is the Chief Marketing Officer at SLT. In his career, Manish has worked as a consultant at McKinsey and led operations at WNS and Capital One. Since joining STL, our NRI knowledge partner for 2020, Manish has been an advocate for innovation and internal change, leading customer engagement at the time when STL is expanding and changing rapidly. And last but not least, Tom Wheeler is a global business leader who continues to contribute to remarkable progress in the ICT sector. Tom served as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 to 2017, and led efforts that resulted in the adoption of increased privacy protections for consumers, better cybersecurity, and net neutrality. I was incredibly lucky when I was still at Public Knowledge and we awarded him a prize for all those accomplishments at the time. Prior to this, Tom led a variety of high-tech companies in the private sector and served as the president of the Cellular, Telecom, and Internet Association. Currently, Tom is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you so much, all of you, to have joined us this morning. Very good. So let's just get straight to it. I'm sure everybody is very excited to start. And please, if you have joined us now this morning, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. Okay, so Larry, let's start with you. It's clear that the pandemic will exacerbate global inequalities. While millions have moved their lives online, over 3 billion people remain disconnected. I had the pleasure of speaking with you about digital divide in our dialogue for digital transformation series a few weeks ago. And I want to return to some of the ideas that you brought up then. In which ways has the crisis exacerbated the digital divide, both globally, but also in North America? And looking ahead, how might we leverage digital tools to close it?
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I think the most clear way it's exacerbated situations, it's education. In the United States, we have 1 out of 3 American children aren't in school and don't have the necessary equipment, either a broadband connection or a computing device to engage in classroom discussions. Fully 1 out of 10 American children have neither. And it's not just K through 12. I'm on the board of 2 different universities. Across our system, many students in universities can't keep up with their university studies because they don't have access to information. Globally, we have 1.7 billion children who are school age K through 12, and over 500 million of them are neither in school nor have the necessary equipment in which to stay engaged in education. And that disproportionately affects people in the global South, and it disproportionately affects girls and young women. So we're looking at, and the people who are affected by this are already the people who are behind. When you look at the folks who aren't in school in America, I went to a school in Queens, New York, a public school. 43% of the kids in that public school that I went to were already a grade or 2 behind because of systemic inequities in the United States. Now they've been out of school since March, and there's got to be a quarter to a third of them who have neither broadband sufficient for education nor a computing device. So now we have a thing called learning loss every summer, where kids go away from school in May and they come back in August or September, or leave in June, but August, September, and that 1 or 2 month we're seeing declines in those kids' abilities. Imagine what happens when a child is out of school from March till September, October, November, and that's just one clear disadvantage. I know we have people who know a lot more about healthcare than I do, but think about the healthcare inequities. Prior to the pandemic, about 11% of Americans used telehealth from their home. We're now up over 46% of Americans use telehealth. But let's think about who's on the other side of the 54%. That 54% are disproportionately poor, they're disproportionately rural, they're disproportionately elderly, they're disproportionately people who already had comorbidities, and they're not able to take advantage of the incredible luxuries that folks like all of us on this call can, to talk to our doctor over a broadband connection. Tom and I have a friend who's a former FCC commissioner. That friend would probably be dead because he had COVID, and but for engaging with his doctor over Zoom or telehealth, he would never have gone into the hospital. Far too many people in the neighborhood I grew up in, neighborhoods across this country or in rural America who don't even have this access, can avail themselves of these opportunities and run the risk of dying. And one last issue, and that's I'm in this on the Zoom a lot more than I want to. I think my eyes are going to fall out of my head, but I'm able to conduct my business over Zoom. I'm able to engage in commerce over Zoom. I'm able to talk to my clients over Zoom. But so many Americans don't have that luxury. And again, the folks who aren't able to use these technologies, they either don't have access to it or because their jobs don't enable it, are also the folks on the front line of COVID. 1 out of 1,000 African Americans who were alive in March are dead today because of COVID. 1 out of every 1,250 Latinos in America who were alive in March are dead today because of Zoom. We'll be at 1 out of 500 Black Americans and 1 out of 700 Latino Americans within 6 months. And if we were able to have more exchanges, more folks are able to use these technologies, we'd be able to reduce those numbers. Hope I didn't go on too long, but I think that shows the enormity of this problem. And we can use technology. We are using technology. We're using to incredible advantage, but only for some and only for the already advantaged.
Thank you, Larry. It's a really strong wake-up call. That all the data you mentioned, and I hope we can think about what that data actually means on the day-to-day. So thank you for that wake-up call. So Lara, Larry did mention the health side of things, and that's one of the biggest reasons I really wanted you to join this panel. So thank you again for joining. You guys are doing incredible work on figuring out the health impact. So let me just go straight to your question. So among many things, the pandemic has provided major momentum for innovation in healthcare and medicine. What impact has the digital moment brought about by the pandemic had on large scale collaborative biomedical research?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to bring a message of hope from the world of biomedical research. What we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years in biomedical research is great enablement by digital technologies, and in particular, the access to cloud compute and computational algorithms that we can start to apply to our healthcare data, our biomedical research data. But what we found over the years with those sorts of approaches is that the amount of data you need to actually make meaning out of health science research is more than any one institute has. And so we need to move to a world where we're sharing data across institutes to be able to make the most impactful insights. And that just hasn't been happening effectively. Our scientific system in the US is not set up for collaboration. It's set up for competition across institutes, and that has very much hampered us. And so even though all of the technologies exist to support large-scale collaboration across the country, it hasn't happened. And that has changed with the pandemic. And so we've seen this across the board. We see the sharing of data so that we can build better forecasting models of how the disease is going to spread across the country and across the world, and where we need to be mobilizing our healthcare resources. And increasingly, we're seeing a sharing of data across the individual healthcare systems and clinical sites across the country. And that's been incredibly important as we watch these waves of the pandemic move across the country. It's not 3 waves in the same hospital, it's 3 waves across different parts of the country. And so you need to be information sharing and data sharing across healthcare institutes in order to be able to inform those on the front line as the front line continues to move. And so that's been pretty incredible. And again, I want to emphasize, it was not a technological transformation. The technology existed. It was one of incentives and a need to be working together.
Thank you, Lara. I couldn't agree more, the issue of incentives. Many years ago, I was working with Yochai Benkler at the Berkman Center, and I sent a survey out for a lot of the centers that Obama was financing in his first term. He had put billions on opening these first centers on core science and core physics and really the basics, right? So we would get a step ahead. And it was amazing that the survey was on knowledge governance, and it was amazing to hear that all the incentives they knew about were patents and papers. It was nothing about collaboration, right? And the goal was to actually increase the basic knowledge to move forward on America's ability to innovate, right? So I'm very glad. Well, is one of the COVID silver lines. It's not that I'm very glad, but it's one of the silver lines we see. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the work you guys are doing to enable all that governance. So Tom Wheeler, I would love to come back to you, well, to actually give the words to you now. So digital transformation threatens to leave people behind the curve of progress, and indeed already has, as Larry was mentioning. The launch of the UN roadmap on digital cooperation earlier this summer was a step in the right direction, but more must be done. In your perspective, what is the ideal role of North America political leaders to foster digital transformation that put peoples first? Thank you, Tom.
Well, Carolina, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and what a great group to be with. I was just taking notes on what Lara was saying, and it was a powerful message. And I always take notes when Larry speaks. You know, if you go back and look at it on a worldwide basis, you know, think back to the Millennium Development Goals, right? The UN set up the MDG and said that, you know, by 2015, they would, you know, cut world poverty in half. And they beat that and cut it by 60%, taking 1 billion people out of the lowest levels of poverty. And, you know, the key to that, Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, said the best thing that you can do to eliminate poverty is give people a cell phone. So digital was part of, and the new telecommunications revolution was part of the solution. And then COVID comes along. And there's a new paper out by a colleague of mine at Brookings that says there's been a 20% increase in poverty worldwide as a result of COVID. That's 120 million people. But then, you know, your question then goes on to, okay, what do we do here in North America? And I want to pick up on what my friend Larry said. And that is the role of North American leadership in the world. You know, internationally, we have failed to be leaders, period. And part of the reason that we have failed to be leaders is that we don't step up ourselves. And it's hard to turn around and say, here is the model, follow me, if you're not doing anything. You know, we don't even know how many Americans aren't online. It's somewhere between 10 and 20%, but others say it's a lot higher. True to form, the Trump administration, and particularly the Trump FCC, has been engaging in showbiz rather than substance, running out, pounding their chest, saying, closing the digital divide is our #1 priority, and then not doing it. Or even worse than that, defining the digital divide as something that is about red states rather than blue states. You know, yes, there is a problem connecting rural Americans to the internet, but there are 3 times as many Americans whose houses, you're saying 4, Larry, 4 times? There are 3 to 4 times as many Americans whose homes are passed by high-speed internet who do not have it because they can't afford it. And the administration sits on their hands. So worse than that, they not only sit on their hands, they gut and otherwise hinder the limited program that exists today. So we can't lead in the world if we can't figure out ourselves what we stand for. And that's the tragedy of where we stand today in this country. on the question of how are we going to make sure that everyone has access to the most powerful and pervasive platform in the history of the planet, the platform that will define the 21st century.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, thank you. That another great wake-up call, especially with the elections coming so close, so around the corner. And one of the things I was thinking when you were talking was another panel I had the honor to host in August, which was the launch of the Global Innovation Index, which we do with WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. And both at the GII and the NRI, while US is still one of the top countries, if you see historically, if you compare year by year, you see stagnation. Which means that actually in the long term, if US doesn't do something, it's gonna decrease in terms of competitiveness, innovation ability, and the benefit that its people can access. So thank you, and just to say that we have a chance to change things soon.
Let me just pile on there for a second, okay? Because
go ahead.
We're headed. Everybody keeps worrying about how Russia and China and others are shutting down or limiting their internet, and we're moving from the internet to the splinternet, right? The United States needs to be leading the charge as to how we are going to respond to that. But that means you have to understand what your policy is, what your beliefs are. And we are AWOL, as they say in the Army. We're absent without leave on that front.
Okay, I just want to ask if there are any reactions to that. Otherwise, I would move. Go ahead.
Can I just amplify a little bit?
Sure.
Tom will remember this, and others of you may remember this. When I joined the Clinton administration in 1993, there were 15 million people globally on the internet. There are 4 billion people today. And that's not an accident. It's not that the United States had all the answers, but rather that the United States said, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to use it. Here's what it could mean for your country. I literally hit every continent on the planet except for Antarctica, and if you consider Greenland a continent, over a 7-year period on behalf of the administration, saying here's our national informational infrastructure goal. We called the internet the NII back in the 90s. Here are our NII goals, and then it was our agenda for action. And then we had a GII, which is an agenda for cooperation. And there were a lot of nations who looked at us and said, you're just trying to extend American dominance. You're just trying to forestall the inevitable decline of the United States. Look, we're sharing it. This is open. We want folks to understand what this is. It took the kind of leadership that Tom is talking about. We had an idea of what we wanted to do here. We also had an idea of what it meant for the rest of the world, how they could benefit. And to Tom's other point, 4 billion, and to your initial point, 4 billion people connected globally. Every one of them is better off today than they were in almost any other situation. We're doing things with healthcare. We're doing things with economies. We're allowing people to create all new types of industries. But the stagnation cannot exist. And we've got to find a way. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with Fabrizio Hochstein because we have to find a way to have that digital cooperation you're talking about. But there is one nation that has both the communication skills, has the technological base, and used to have the moral leadership to kind of start that debate.
Right.
I am concerned about your point about the technology. I am even more concerned about the moral leadership. And we've got to reverse that. Because if the United States doesn't stand up and say, this is for all of us, we all benefit, other nations will say, we're going to keep this for those privileged few, or we're going to confine this. And the internet's never been about confining. It's been about expanding.
Carolina, can I just do one little factoid here that Larry probably doesn't even remember?
Sure.
The first time I ever saw an internet browser was in Larry Irving's office. And he takes me around behind his desk and he pulls up this thing called Mosaic and he says, look at this. Look at how this can transform the world. And then with Larry's leadership, the Clinton administration went out and said, this is how we're going to use technology to make a difference in things that have defined mankind from the beginning of time. Today, we walk away from it.
Yes, and it's not just US, right? I'm originally from Brazil. I was in the 90s starting my career at a telco industry in Brazil in Telefonica, and nowadays we don't also have a broadband plan or a national strategy for innovation in Brazil. So you have that problem around the world in many countries, from India, where Manish is, to Brazil, to the US, to various countries. So let's take that and move to you, Manish. So in which ways your sector, you're coming from the private sector, and you are in the private sector right now. So how has your sector, in which ways has your sector's engagement with customers changed to reflect the challenges of the pandemic, but also the challenges of, we can say, this lack of structural governance in a way?
Oh, thanks for asking me that question. And I'm, really torn now as I come to the meeting today to talk about the future. And I'm actually super filled with hope about how the network's going to change the face of Earth, flatten the differences that exist. But I know that there is a fact that whenever there's a little bit of issue, like I can't say COVID-19 is by any measure a little bit of an issue, but whenever there's even a smaller amount of issue, seems like the internet actually becomes expansion of the divide rather than reduction of the divide. And I think, I have seen, at least in India and many parts of the world, that the private sector has tried to play its part, but obviously it is profit driven. But in the period of COVID and in this pandemic, we have actually seen the private sector, sometimes rise up more than we expected them to create relief to customers. And I've seen, as everyone moved from office locations to home locations, the network wasn't ready to support that there. At least in the areas where network existed, people have tried to reformat their network designs. They've tried to offer very low pricing in certain parts of the world. And I'm not only talking about India, our customers are across, for STL, we have customers in India, in Europe, in North Africa, in South Africa, in the Middle Eastern regions. We've seen that people have taken proactive moves to reduce the cost in this period. And as a result, a lot of people are able to go about with their work if they were able to do in the past, and they happen to be in zones where the internet does exist. Now, in the US, even after US being clearly the pioneer of the internet, you have somewhere between 10 to 20%. I thought there was a little debate about whether that number is underexpressed or overexpressed. People not actually having access. In many of the places that we actually serve, those numbers are materially higher, right? They're in the range of 60 to 70% people not having access to the internet. And so I don't expect that to be by any measure a consolation to the US. I do expect the United States and North America to lead the way, to show us how this should be done in every part of the world. And but I do think that the private has a limitation there. I do think that when it comes to the second half of the world, I mean, I think it's very clear that in 2020, this year, while the COVID-19 happened, one other thing happened. More than half of the world got connected. So somewhere in the middle of last year, it was around the 48, 49% of the world was actually connected to the internet. And now I think those numbers vary in the range of 54, 55% at the global scale. And now is the second lap of getting the world onto the internet. And that, I believe, is a place where the private players have a materially different game to play. And that's driven by the economic consideration, just like what Tom and Larry and everyone here have been talking about. The affordability of the top 50% of the world is materially different from the affordability of the next 50%. And if a particular type of internet was created to serve the needs of the first top 50, that's not going to work for the next. And that's where I think the private players have to take a step forward. And I do think that is happening already, to open up the the ecosystem of the internet, to bring down the costs of getting not just internet, but broadband internet, because, you know, even within the internet, there's a lot of types of internet. And if someone has just basic internet connectivity and someone else has high speed, you know, GBPS type of connectivity, it does create a fundamental divide in their ability to make an impact to their own lives and to the world. And I think that the private players are actually taking a step forward, Carolina, in doing that by, we have these open source associations like Open RAN, like the Telecom Infra Project, and, you know, they are being led by the intellectuals of North America. Yes, the world is part of it, but, you know, from out here in India, we look up to North America for coming up with this stuff, right? For bringing the world forward into an open source revolution that is going to, it's already coming up with the internet that can be affordable by the second half of the world. And I think that's a very important role that the private players are playing today. I actually also think that we are creating an immense possibility for bringing down the costs to a very different level. Today, if you look at it, you know, today, if you look at it, India has probably the lowest cost per GB for internet access. You know, and I'm sitting in India, and sorry about that. I'm sitting in India, and I actually am able to connect with you guys pretty much as if I was in the US. And this is an amazing advantage, but my cost per GB is about 10 to 15 cents, whereas the rest of the world is probably averaging at 500 cents, or $5, or maybe even more in certain parts of the world. And I do think that the private players have to actually work towards this by working together. You know, in this pandemic, we have seen usage go up like crazy, right? We have seen sometimes VoIP or video conferencing going up by 200%, and you know, VPN traffic has gone up by 40%. And interestingly, this is not the growth that was expected in the beginning of January. But, you know, it's an E&Y study says that more than 60% of the customers are satisfied. So we have got something going right, but we do actually have the next 40% and the 2x growth that sits in front of us that we have to support. So I think this private has to not think only profit, has to think of the absolute value that we add to the world. And I do think that there are some very good movements happening in that. Right? Companies like ours are actually also making that effort. You know, through the pandemic, we have been producing fiber and writing code and sending it across 100 countries that we serve, trying to make sure that nothing stops. But I do think it's the beginning of a journey, and certainly folks from North America have to show us the way. So.
Thank you so much, Manish. And I just want to acknowledge and thank Professor Soumitra Dutta, who is my co-founder and president of Portulans, for joining us. I'm just going to introduce him quickly. So Soumitra, he is the co-founder and president of Portulans Institute. He's also a professor of management and former founding dean at the College of Business at Cornell University. Prior to joining Cornell, Soumitra was on the faculty of INSEAD in Switzerland. Soumitra is a global thought leader in digital readiness and transformation, and has co-edited and co-authored the Network Readiness Index since its beginning, including when it was with the World Economic Forum, in addition to the Global Innovation Index and the Global Information Technology Report. So thank you for joining us this morning, Soumitra. So Lara, I want to come back to you and then to Larry and Tom. We are talking a lot about digital transformation and how that can better people's lives. But one of the forces that's part of that discussion sometimes can challenge that discussion is privacy and data governance in a way. So how can digital transformation ensure that we have and we rebuild a more inclusive, accessible, and digitally transformed healthcare system while paying attention to issues of privacy and good data governance?
Yeah, I think by doing it incredibly carefully, right? So we've seen there's a whole series of ways that data can be governed. And again, I'm looking primarily in the biomedical research world, but that each possible choice really needs to be tailored to the situation. And so, for example, when we see researchers coming together across institutes around a certain kind of research question they want to ask, whether it's, you know, evaluating COVID treatment approaches from electronic medical records, or it's looking at, you know, forecasting data or viral sequencing data, right? The way that data needs to be governed is very much tailored by what you want to do with the data and who the data is coming from. And so there's not a one size fits all approach to this. And ultimately what's allowed researchers to succeed in the field is tailoring the combination of policy or governance and technology, right, together. So who needs to see the data for what purposes, and let's make a fit for purpose data governance approach for that. And when we have tried to do so in a more universal manner that isn't customizing or tailoring, it's not working. And that's particularly true as we attempt to go out and integrate people into data sets that who are not usually represented in data, because there's this long history of harm and distrust appropriately. And there we need to really move into a community and understand what the value for engaging in research might be and what the possible harms might be, and make sure that the data governance supports that group in the way that they feel comfortable being supported. And often, I mean, that's just a lot of work. So often that just doesn't happen effectively, which means that we can lead either to situations where the governance doesn't really work, and therefore people aren't interested in being represented in the research and they walk away, or even more terribly, additional harms happen. So so the privacy has to be at the front, or none of the rest of this is gonna work.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you so much for that comment. And Larry, so coming back to you, right? So as we mentioned before, and also what Lara brought now, we can have yet another crisis, right? We have a trifecta crisis: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis. And I'm really concerned that if we don't get the digital transformation right and the data governance right, we're gonna have yet another crisis, which are people completely ostracized from the benefits of the potential health advances we might have at this point, right? But anyway, so, and this crisis, I feel they are deeply rooted in inequalities in North America. But they also hopefully may represent a turning point, right? I think this panel has brought a lot of wake-up calls, but also there is some hope here. So how could digital transformation be leveraged towards hope, to rebuild these better, more equal economies in a post-COVID world? And going back to the leadership comments, what is the type of leadership that North America needs to ensure its competitiveness, right? To really leave that stagnation behind.
I want to tie a couple of different things together. I want to tie some of the things that Manisha talked about, a little bit of what Lara talked about. The United States has never been a leader in privacy and data governance where we should be. Full confession, I am one of the authors of the light touch regulatory model. And I think the light touch regulatory model works when you're talking about baby little companies that are just beginning. But when that baby grows up to be a dinosaur or a grizzly bear, then maybe you need to have a slightly different approach than you had when that baby was a cute little cub. And I think we've allowed the economic interests of a few United States companies to drive our policies to a greater extent than we should have. And we've got to come back to that. We've got to rethink that. We've got to put, Tom, I think, used the term, and I think used the term of putting people first. That was actually the motto of the Clinton administration during the time I was there, was putting people first. And the internet, because I think we were so focused on not doing things to disrupt this incredible revolution, of not, putting obstacles toward growth and innovation and scale, that we forgot about the people part of it. And so you're seeing it in terms of misinformation and disinformation. You're seeing it in terms of people's concerns about privacy. And because of the commercial abuses of some of the United States, some North American and Western companies, you're seeing a backlash in the rest of the world, where China, for example, has a government surveillance system, to me, which is much more problematic than a commercial surveillance. But they can say, when you look at the abuses in the United States, we have to do something differently. We can't do what they did. We've got to have our own resolution. Now, having said that, I'm incredibly optimistic that we'll get this right, that people of goodwill and good hearts will come together and figure out the right balance. We want companies to be profitable. We want costs to be down. And a lot of the commercial, quote unquote, surveillance is what keeps advertising, is what keeps the cost in America and Western economies down. But it's come at a huge cost in terms of privacy and data governance. We're going to have to rebalance those scales. And I think you're beginning to see it, not just through the antitrust, but across the platforms. But let me talk about a company that I think is doing it a little bit right. I have no commercial interest. They're not a client, but I think that they've had some really smart ideas in some of these issues. Godaddy, which is not a company that I ever thought of being particularly innovative. If you go on their website, they have something called Venture Forward. And what Godaddy has discovered is that micro ventures, small entrepreneurs that use their service, are driving economic wealth in communities that need economic wealth. And what those folks need? They need technological literacy. They need access to capital. They need access to broadband. But again, let's go back to my little community of Queens, New York. Well, not little, because it's 3 million people, but you go to Queens, New York. If you had to close your bakery, or you had a hair products business, or or some type of an entrepreneur, and you had to shutter your physical location, what GoDaddy found out was that those folks were going online. Side hustles, quote unquote, as we say in the United States, are a way of life in America. And GoDaddy has discovered that micro ventures allow folks to engage in side hustles to a degree they never had to before because of the pandemic. But one company doing a huge scale, allowing us to see in real time what's happening, what communities, and because there is a network effect. When 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 small micro ventures develop in a community, a whole bunch of other micro ventures also pop up. It's that kind of insight, using data, using technology, and then figuring out how we can push it further, that I think is going to help us. And the last point, obviously I was taking oblique, or maybe not so oblique, swipes at Facebook and Google and Amazon and others that have somewhat of a privacy invasive business model. But those companies also have an opportunity, if they're smart and if they're focused and if they see the change that's happening in Washington, D.C., to think about how they can use their tools and technologies to advance this. Because if they stay where they are and they don't understand that existing practices are not going to be leveraged, not in the United States or Europe or globally, if they don't rethink them, they're going to fail. But they have the access to the best technologies. They have some of the smartest people, and they are ubiquitous brands. They've got to rethink their brand image and find out how can they help in this time instead of how they can just help their shareholders at this time.
Thank you, Larry, so much for that. Marie, so thank you so much for joining us today from UNESCO in New York, and congratulations on the 75 years of that UN is going through this year. So happy anniversary. So back to you, a question to you. What is needed to ensure that no one is left behind? You worked so much on issues like education and health, working exactly towards that goal. And ensuring that all can harness the benefits of this digital transformation through even the hustles like Larry was just mentioning now, and how UNESCO is contributing to that here in the region.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Institute for your cooperation. I think that it is very important to have this kind of discussion, and it's very timely. I would like first to make some personal comments. As I am based in New York, I think that there are 3 dimensions, and the digital transformation is really in the heart of what happens today. Because in fact, when we're speaking about the COVID-19 crisis here in New York, in fact, we're speaking of the measures that we have taken to face the COVID-19. Of course, there is a pandemic. Of course, there is a health and a research scientific issue. But in fact, the decisions that we have taken, in particular when we have decided to take measures of lockdown in the world, that has affected, as Larry has underlined, that's affected education system all over the world, not only New York, but all over the world. And so there is an immediate impact of the digital transformation on how to approach education today. So it is about more than 1.5 billion students who suddenly stop to go to school, to go to the universities. And that has changed the model of teaching. That has changed the model of having access to education and to launch a new virtual system of education. And so you were mentioning some data. I would like to refer to the fact that we have also to speak about access to internet at home, not only access to internet, but access to internet at home. And I think that according to our estimates, 43% in the world of access to internet at home. So only 82% when we are speaking about students in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that the question of no one left behind is also the question in New York when we are at the UN to think here in New York how to have no one left behind, not only in New York, but all over the world. And this is changing also, of course, the relationship inside the United Nations system. Impact in New York also about the multilateralism. I think that digital transformation is about the negotiation in New York. You have a lot of negotiation. Since March, a lot of meetings are not taking place anymore in persons. That means that, the flexibility you have to negotiate in the diplomatic world, you have to change the way that you are negotiating. You have less and less relationship and direct relationship. And this is also a lot of question about affecting digital transformation there is a chance that it's going to affect the multilateralism as it was for 75 years now today. So this is really crucial, how it will affect this. And it is also the daily life. Of course, in New York, more than ever, I think more than other cities in the United States, is affected by the new way of working, telecommuting. And I said this, I think that you are fully right when you are saying we have to put the people first. Putting the people first is really in our heart. So, as an observer, international observer of this situation, of the digital transformation affecting really the daily life and also the world life here in New York, I think that, of course, North America is in the front line to address this question with your institute, with your research. You couldn't minimize the fact that you are not only addressing the question of digital transformation in North America, but North America as hosting this international life, which has been really seriously affected, not only in the field of education, science, but also in the field of international relations, globalization, and access, maybe creating increasing poverty in the world. So having said that, I just would like to share with you some maybe more information about what UNESCO is doing. I will try to be short, even if I have a lot of information coming from our colleagues working hard on this issue. You know that the Secretary General has launched a roadmap for digital cooperation earlier this year. And we have identified more or less 5 directions to face the digital transformation. We think that first we must build an inclusive digital economy and society. And as I said, in this world, women are more affected than young girls, when we're speaking about education, are more affected by the digital transformation, digital divide than others. We're speaking worldwide of 2 billion women who are offline. So we must invest in diversity, notably by empowering actors from the global south and marginalized groups, including indigenous communities. And I think this is also, in American society very important, how to involve more the indigenous groups of this country. We know that according to OECD, 7% of ICT patents in G20 countries are obtained by women, and only 10% of technology startup companies seeking venture capital funding were founded by women. So these figures, we have a lot of figures, which underlies the need to urgently identify bias in existing technologies. You know, we are looking at the screen, we are nearly gender balanced, but we have to identify bias in existing technologies such as facial recognition and recruitment platform based on algorithms. Curate inclusively by ensuring diversity in data sets and in digital workforce. And third, develop conscientiously by ensuring ethical standards and training in digital literacy, as well as multi-stakeholder approaches. Secondly, we must develop human and institutional capacity. Democracy is not just about voting for your leaders. It is a principle premised upon ordinary citizens understanding the issues and having the tools necessary to collectively propose solutions that benefit all. And we need democratic debates. As you said, all of you, I think that we need democratic debate on what our digital future looks like. But we also need to ensure democratic participation through developing human and institutional capacity in this field. So we need to invest in digital literacy to ensure that all of us, we not only we have to understand, but we have also to empower the people to be creators of solutions themselves. And here again, I would like to highlight that we must invest in capacity building, invest in women. This is really in our heart, and I will be the first to fight for that. So in addition to that, to invest in digital literacy, we must invest in research. I think that you are doing a lot, and I think that this is quite important. Improve data, improve information if we have to avoid the risk, both social and economic, of brain drain. Further investment must be made to support programs in the field of digital transformation. So furthermore, we must advocate for the link between inclusive digital transformation and open access to scientific information, open educational resources, and open access at large. So I have to raise the issues that a resolution has been adopted last year at the request of 2 member states, in particular from South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, asking for improving access to information. And I think we have to think that here in North America, here in New York, this country are fighting to have an equal access to information. And this is really has to be taken into consideration by North America. And we must also ensure that institutional capacity building in the development of policies must support local startup economies. And this is again what you raised. I think that this is the impact of digital transformation. And I would like to maybe to make it short, I would like to say that we must promote digital trust, security, and stability. This is particularly crucial in the field of artificial intelligence. And in this area, I would like to mention the fact that Unesco is working hard. In particular, we are working in facilitating international cooperation and shaping the future of artificial intelligence. We are now elaborating a first global normative instrument in the form of a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So when we're speaking about digital transformation, no one left behind. We're speaking about equal access to information. We're speaking about strengthening capacity building. We're strengthening about more data. We're speaking about also thinking about the no one left behind, not only in North America, but all over the world. We have to think about also this new model of multilateralism that we have to build. Don't forget that the host country and New York is the host of the United Nations, where there is a place to facilitate this interconnected world. But in any case, thank you, Lara, to deliver with you a good signal, a positive signal that finally, unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, we have an improvement of using digital transformation in a positive manner. I think we have to find a way to make it for education as a whole, and we have to do it also for diplomatic relationship. You know, facing all these debates and all this negotiation, where you have so many places in the world where you have wars, where you have really instability, where you have poverty, we have to think how digital transformation could be used in a positive manner to improve relationship among the nations, the global level, improve diplomatic relationship. I think that more than ever, and particularly today when we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in New York, I couldn't believe that we could forget this incredible challenge, unbelievable challenge that you have here in North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. That was incredible. I think I love how holistic your comments were, because you are right with the new and upcoming technologies from AI to IoT and all of that. We need to make sure that we build those things correctly so people are not left behind. I just want to actually to that, I think the Ford Foundation is doing something very interesting now. They are in the second round of grants related to bias in infrastructure, in core infrastructure issues, right? So I hope we're gonna have a lot of that data and a lot of more understanding coming from those grants, including, for example, gender issues and all the things that are really deep, right? When we talk about privacy by design, AI by design, ethics by design, how can we make sure that there is no bias by design, right? I think it's very interesting to see and comment all of that. So actually related to this, Tom, I wanna come back to you and turn to the issue of platforms and regulation. A lot of the digital transformation here is happening because we turn to platforms to help us through that path. Especially because, as Mary said, a lot of people don't have all the skills they need, so they turn to platforms to support jumping into the digital in a much smoother, seamless way, right? So in a recent article to The Time, you argue that the US Department of Justice antitrust suit against Google is important, but not sufficient. The pandemic crisis and antitrust hearings this summer have risen digital questions higher up on the policymaking agenda. So how can political leaders and advocates seize this unique opportunity to build better digital oversight of big tech and better protections for the citizens around the world to really counter all the risks that Marie and all the other speakers mentioned before?
Well, Carolina, that's a excuse me, that's a great question, and I think you've seen the flow of the discussion here, starting with Larry, who was talking about the early days of digital technology and how policy had to respond in those days, and closing here with Marie, who says, "But wait a minute, we got some new realities here, 20 years later." Those new realities are rooted in the fact that big tech makes the rules, and those rules are based on a business model that exploits personal information to establish monopolies. There was a recent study, 450-page study out of the House Antitrust Subcommittee that talked about the abusive and harmful, quote unquote, practices of the digital platforms, and then went on to enumerate them. We are stuck in a policy that was appropriately established 20 years ago and has failed to evolve. It is time to get the public interest into this equation, not just the interests of the big digital companies. It's terrific that there are antitrust actions being brought. But the reality of antitrust is that it takes too long to deliver too little, that it is very focused, that it is a lengthy process that goes on for years and years, that is built on an after the fact situation. The harms have already been caused. So the point I was making in that Time article that you referenced was that we also need regulation, and we need to establish in regulation, in conjunction with antitrust, basic public interest principles, and I think they go back to basic common law principles about what are the expectations of these companies, and we need to move on. So every time that there has been a new platform in history, whether it was the ICC created to oversee the railroads, which were the internet of the 19th century, or whether it was the FCC created to oversee broadcasters, or whether it was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there's always been a group of experts brought together to oversee policy and to develop the appropriate responsive policies. We need, in the United States government and around the world, people with digital DNA who are representing the public interest and making rules that create the guardrails for the digital companies.
Thank you so much, Larry. Definitely, and
I'm Tom. Don't compare. I have hair. There's a difference, you know.
Thank you, Tom.
We look a lot alike. We're confused all the time.
You guys look alike. No, I was actually saying thank you, Tom, and I was remembering so many conversations I had with Gene Kimmelman, who is a, I'm sure, good friend of yours and a mentor and a friend, and was my boss for many years, and now is a board member. And for many years, we have been discussing platform regulation, even when I was actually working for Facebook. And it's very interesting that you have to have that coming from outside, right? We cannot wait for the companies to give us the solution for that regulation, because again, as Manish said earlier, the incentives are different. So I really hope that the 450 pages report and the antitrust issue against Google really open a very serious conversation on how we can move this regulation forward, so digital transformation can really benefit all and is not and should not be just about data, right? As you said in the beginning.
And one more report there, Carolina, is that Gene and Phil Verveer and I recently published a report at the Harvard Kennedy School calling for the creation of a new digital platform agency, accompanied by a new approach to regulation that walks away from industrial era structures of regulation and thinks about what's necessary for digital issues.
Thank you, Tom. And for those who are watching us, we are sharing the links to those articles in the chat. And we are going to make sure to also share all those references in our recap of this panel. So without delay, let's move forward with Soumitra Dutta presenting the results of the NRI. So thank you, Soumitra, for joining us this morning. And I pass the floor to you. And after that, all the panelists, we will have opportunity to comment and react.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you to all the panel members for the great comments. I think there are a number of very important issues in your comments that I think you will see are integrated inside the Network Readiness Index model. Please allow me to share my screen just to be able to get the process started. I hope my screen is visible now, Carolina.
Yes, it's good.
Good. So we are very pleased to share with you the results from the Network Readiness Index of 2020. As you can imagine, the focus of the index this year very much was on trying to understand digital transformation, especially in a post-COVID global economy. And for helping us sort of navigate through this, I wanted to just walk through 4 points out here. The first one is, what is the NRI? The second one is briefly talk through the rankings of the NRI. Focus a little on digital transformation issues that we think are very critical, and end with some of the key messages out here. Of course, I also wanted to thank STL for their sponsorship and partnership of this effort this year. So let me begin with the NRI and provide some context out here. Very much aligned with some of the comments made of what I heard in the last half an hour, is we have seen a shift in the pendulum of how technology is viewed today in society. I think 20 years ago, there was a tremendous amount of optimism about how technology would make the world a better place, how technology would, stimulate and accelerate development in different parts of the world, improve competitiveness. And back in 2002, my colleague Bruno Lanva and I were part of a small group at the World Economic Forum that were asked to come up with a model to reflect that optimism, hope about how technology would help development, help competitiveness. So back in 2002, we came up with the Network Readiness Index, which was part of a report called the Global Information Technology Report. And this was published by the forum for about 15 years, till 2016 time period. And what was interesting about that index back in 2002, as compared to the other global index that was popular in those years, the ITU Development Index, was that while the ITU index focused very much on the technology technical parameters, the Network Readiness Index very much from the start focused on the broader positioning of technology in the social context, in the country economic context, in the government context. And we try to understand how technology is affected and influenced by these kinds of parameters. Today, all of these elements seem obvious, but what I can tell you, and many of you remember it, back in 2001 time period, the whole issue of linkage between regulation or societal issues and technology was not that obvious. So I think that we were quite, let's say, a little bit forward-looking, and then NRI was very useful. Now, what has happened over the last 2 decades is that this technology pendulum has sort of shifted towards the other end. It's not that technology is not helping development competitiveness. Of course, technology even today is creating enormous opportunities to development and competitiveness. But what has happened is technology has also created a number of side effects that we perhaps had not anticipated. Perhaps regulation wasn't prepared for it. As Tom mentioned, perhaps a number of sort of consequences emerged. We were not prepared for it. And as a result, what we find today when we discuss technology, the focus somehow has shifted to concerns around how technology is impacting us, usually negatively, and all the other different forms in which privacy, security, and fake news, and all the other kinds of concerns are emerging about how it's possibly even impacting some of the core basis of our societies. For example, today technology, some people would argue, is hurting democracy or is questioning whether democracy can even exist in many countries as a form of governance. So in some sense, what has happened out here is the pendulum has shifted, and we felt that the NRI needed to be rethought and sort of reconceptualized to reflect this current set of concerns, and to also reflect the need for us to rebalance the two. So in many ways, we went through a whole reimagination of the NRI. And the model that we use is the one that is depicted on the right. At the heart of it, it's a very simple sort of belief that underlies the model. And the simple belief is that we somehow have to get technology and people working well together under the right governance structure to have the right kind of impact we seek. And the impact is, of course, not just only on economic impact, but also societal impact, quality of life, also the environment, SDG goals. And the governance aspect is something which is very critical, which was mentioned in the comments earlier, is elements like trust, regulation, inclusion. I think the comment was made earlier about how a large proportion of the world's population is today not really connected to the internet. And these kinds of issues have risen top of the agenda. We also see that how new technologies like AI are in fact becoming critical as countries seek that kind of competitive advantage. So what we're really doing out here is we have reconceptualized NRI to reflect what we believe are some of the issues that government societies have to focus on as they prepare for the future, as we prepare for a future where technology is an integral and a positive part of our lives. And in fact, where technology leads us collectively in the right direction. So that's the structure. And we have, these 4 pillars: technology, people, governance, and impact. We try to keep it as simple as possible. We have sub-pillars and 3 dimensions for each of these pillars, and we have indicators that help us compute that. Now, of course, the rankings are something that a lot of people focus on. And this year, we were able to cover 134 economies. We deliberately make a choice of covering more as opposed to few. So we favor breadth over depth in the sense that had we limited ourselves to just a smaller set of countries like OECD countries, we could have perhaps benefited from much more richer data. But we have chosen to, in fact, cover more countries and emerging markets and so on. As soon as you increase the number of countries covered, the quality of data and the depth of the data decreases. If you look at these top 10 countries, what you see, of course, is a very strong dominance of high-income countries. You see a very strong dominance of Scandinavian countries, countries in Asia like Singapore, and of course, the US. US is probably one of the largest states in the top 10, and that's to its credit. US is a technology leader in multiple ways, and so US continues to be in the top 10. We can talk later about why it is not number 1, when many would argue that Silicon Valley is unparalleled in the world, and and US clearly has a number of world-leading technology hotspots. If you look at the data, you can, of course, analyze the data in multiple ways. This is a very crowded chart, but the basic thing to take from this chart is on the vertical axis, you have the NRI score. On the horizontal axis, you have the GDP per capita in PPP terms. And what you see is that in general, the NRI score shows some kind of a positive correlation with increasing wealth. So it's an interesting question of causality out here, but clearly the richer countries tend to have the better kind of conditions and better elements that give them a higher NRI score. And there might be some causality out there in terms of how the NRI score affects the investments in information technology and how that in fact affects other elements of the NRI model. Now, we're also able to identify the leaders by the pillar. And of course, I'm going through the results very briefly and also quite rapidly. I encourage you and everyone else to look at the rankings and the report in more detail on the website, which is networkreadinessindex.org. Now here, if you look at the different dimensions, you see some of the top performers in those different categories. And I think in many ways, you have to go and look at some of the underlying variables that will give us a better sense of how and why these countries appear at the top list out there. But you see some familiar names in that list in terms of the top performers in each pillar. You can also look at the top performers by income groups. And you have, of course, the high income countries, the upper middle income, the lower middle income, and low income countries. Once again, some familiar names out there, but you might see some names that you might actually question or you might wonder about. But again, the data, in fact, supports their position based on the model that uses NRI. And that, I think, also is an interesting part of an exercise like this, because on one hand, exercise shows you obvious examples that you know and you hear about often. And at the same time, it throws up names of countries and regions that you perhaps haven't identified clearly as being excellent or in some sense leading in some areas of technology. And I think it allows us to have a broader perspective of technology performers in the world. Similarly, if you look at the performers by region, you get a different kind of list of names out here. But once again, the same comment about how some countries continue to excel in technology and NRI issues, and some others perhaps are catching up in these domains. Now, looking at the US in particular, so what you see out here is that the US has these relative ranks on the various pillars. So the strength of the US by the NRI model is clearly on the technology side, and the weakness is on the impact side. So in some sense, one could argue then say that, well, the US has tremendous strengths in various domains of technology, various strengths in other areas of people and governance too, but somehow the benefits of technology haven't been spread as equal in society as perhaps they could be. Someone mentioned earlier the issue of remote learning and so on. And we know that in the US, even in the middle of the COVID crisis, about 22% of households do not really have access to the internet. And so even in a very rich leading economy, you have this kind of inequalities and discrepancies. So I think that's a broader issue that impacts the US ranking on the impact side. Now, as far as Canada, which is the other large country next to the US, we see that the rank is 13th on the whole. And Canada's main challenge is to be able to increase the ICT usage amongst the different actors, the individuals, businesses, and the government. So that's where it ranks 18th in the people dimension. And clearly out here, what you see is that Canada could do better in terms of increasing the intensity of ICT usage inside its own population. Canada has been trying recently of late to also invest more in advanced technologies and in technology, but that's an area where also it can improve further. It's currently ranked number 12. Now, let's look at digital transformation as a theme, which is something we tried to focus on in the report this year. And we have, in addition to the data collection and the work of NRI, also conducted a series of in-depth interviews with global thought leaders, government experts, CEOs, and private sector innovators. And this is called the Digital Transformation Dialogue Series. And I encourage you to look at these series of interviews online. They are an excellent collection of thought leaders with provocative thoughts on how digital transformation is affecting our lives. And they provide a very good complement to, I think, the report itself. Now, what we also realize is there are some key questions on digital transformation that we have to address. The report, of course, is one starting point in the process of trying to address them. And those three questions, that I distill them in, first of all, is this whole notion of how is digital transformation impacting global inequality. There is some evidence to show that digital transformation, digital technologies, in fact, is perhaps increasing inequality in some areas. So the whole issue of is digital technologies transformation helping us create more equality, or if it is not, how can we do so is a very important question. Digital technologies transformation, is it leading to better lives? I think this is also an important question. We have a number of stories about gig workers and how gig workers are denied some of the benefits of employees and perhaps have a much more difficult existence to live, and to, in fact, they have to work in multiple jobs to be able to meet the needs of the families. And collectively, if digital technologies and platforms are leading to an economy of gig workers, is that good for people? I think that's an important question. And how do we, in fact, balance in this whole notion of privacy in the whole debate? As we're losing control of privacy and security, are we basically leading better lives, or in fact, are we being controlled by technology? So the whole idea of are we in control, or are the tech platforms, big tech companies controlling our lives? These are some very important questions that I don't think have been addressed completely, or we don't have the answers completely, but I think they are on top of the agenda. And clearly the NRI, by the current model and the current thinking, tries to make them much more explicit in terms of how we address them. So if I just end with this one sort of slide, which talks about the key messages. So what do we find after looking at the data, what we find of looking at all these interviews that we conducted? What we find is that digital transformation needs to be a system-wide effort. It's not something that can be localized in one example, on one domain, or in one function. It needs to touch the organization in multiple aspects. So, I'm in education, university, and we are in front of a massive digital tsunami in education. And that is touching every single part of what university stands for: faculty, students, buildings, investment approaches, other kinds of, what does university life look like, and so on. Now, what we also worry about is digital transformation may create new forms of digital divides. I saw a study that even in Manhattan, one of the richest cities in the world, there's tremendous amounts of digital differences, access to digital technology differences between the southern part, which is richer, and the northern part, which is poorer. And these kinds of digital divides, which happen not just in poor countries, but also in rich countries of the US, have important implications as our life moves to a more digital sort of format and hybrid formats. Trust, security are central. I've talked about this earlier, about how the pendulum has shifted. And if we are not able to rebuild trust and security in technology, I think we are hurting some of the core fabric of our society, because society is based on trust, security. And if technology somehow hurts that, I think that's a concern for us, all of us, in the future. The COVID crisis, as we know, has certainly speeded up this whole digital transformation process, acceleration, massive acceleration out there. And we see that this is going to have a tremendous impact on digital transformation in the future. Education reskilling, very critical, because if without the kind of skills and to be able to take advantage of digital technologies, one can't really do much. And also for the SDG goals, a lot of concerns right now about how we might actually miss the SDG goals, and how perhaps the economic recessions and the crisis we're having right now might dampen progress towards it. But on the positive side, digital transformation can actually help accelerate the implementation of at least some of the SDG goals. For example, health, for example, education. They can get a big boost by using technology much more effectively to achieve those goals. And finally, of course, digital transformation can also help build global cooperation and redefine globalization. And that's an area of some concern, because we have seen some kind of a parting of ways between America and China in particular, but there's some kind of balkanization of the internet happening. And we have to somehow try and see how we can overcome some of those barriers, because for good innovation, you need good information flows, you need actually sharing information. So thank you very much for your attention, and for allowing me to share this index. As I said, you can look at the index in more detail and download all the data and other kinds of information at the website address shown out there. And I hand the floor back to you, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Soumitra, for that. And I would like to go a little bit in order on how you guys appear in my screen here. But actually, Marie, since I know you need to leave soon for the UN commemorations, I just want to ask some of your reactions, and then move to Tom, Lara, Larry, and Manish. So Marie.
Yes, very quickly. Congratulations, Soumitra. I was just writing a message to you. I think that you raise a good point, and in somehow window of hope. You're offering, solutions. I was quite interested by your study and the ranking study you made. I was also positively impressed with the replies you got from some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where I could think that where we could build on it. In any case, I think that, as I said previously, based in New York myself, and looking as an observer at North America, but also as a world relationship, I think that there is a major issue on trying to work on digital transformation, as you said at the end of your presentation, as working as on digital transformation as a tool to implement Agenda 2030 and to reach the objectives that we set up in 2015. Just to know, to leave no one behind, and I think that your study is quite interesting. But we need exactly what you said, more data, and I think that there are a lot of initiatives here in New York about digital transformation, and we hope that United States of America would be even more present in the elaboration of this policy at the global level, because I think that sorry to say that at the end, but sometimes the feeling that we have here, of course, there is a rich information in America, as you said. You could be a global leader, but the global leader maybe could even be more present in the world if you think of the international community present here in the States. So having said that, I have to leave, unfortunately, but it's very interesting for this excellent meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marie, for joining us today. And it's one of the most interesting things about indexes, right? So we use a lot of international organizations data, which actually are sent from governments to the international organizations and so forth, so on. So I love to think about the NRI as an assessment tool for the future, right? So what is that data telling you? What is the path that an assessment tool like the NRI can give you in terms of understanding where you are doing good, where you can do better, and even observing cross-country examples and best practice and even policies, right? So I just want to move on then. So Ton, can I get your reactions?
Sure. Well, I think that Soumitra and Marie just laid out the roadmap. I mean, that's a great study that you did, Soumitra, and looking at the United States, I was stunned. High ranking on technology, high ranking on people, high ranking on governance, but lower ranking on impact of society. And that is a systematic failure. And then Marie turns around and says, I hope that the United States will become more active in providing some international leadership. Well, the problem is that B follows A. And the question is, how do we get there? And I go back to the fact that I think that it means that we need to have a structure in oversight of the companies that expects more of them and establishes a national policy for that. You know, the move fast and break things is a great mantra, but it's really ended up meaning move fast and make your own rules before the other guys catch up. And that's the situation that we're in right now. Well, you know, when I was at the FCC, I was forever being bombarded by members of Congress and think tanks and others saying, "Oh, you don't dare touch these digital companies. You know, there's magic going on there, and you might break that magic if you, quote, regulate the internet." You know, and then there was this great term that I'm sure Larry also got sick of hearing called permissionless innovation, as though anybody ever had to go get permission from the government to innovate. But what we have proposed in our paper at Harvard is not only that we need public interest oversight, but we need it done in a different way. And that when when we went to regulate the industrial economy, we took industrial management techniques and brought them to government. Now we need to have oversight of the digital economy, but you cannot do it with industrial era techniques. What were industrial era techniques? They were rules-based bureaucracies, just like you ran companies. Today you have distributed, agile management that Soumitra, as the dean of a business school, can explain far better than I can. But the question is, how do you bring that into government and the oversight of these companies? And only by doing that will we be able to address that high, not so high impact on benefiting society reality that Soumitra's study demonstrated.
Definitely. Thank you, Tom. And
Can I make one comment
Sure.
on Tom's observation? You know, living in the US and being part of the US, I think what we all realize is the US is the leader of the world today. Okay, there's no question about it in multiple ways. And the world looks up to the US. You know, the world might complain about the US, it's fine, but the world does look up to the US, especially in the world of technology where the US tech firms lead. You know, the best tech firms are from the US, so there's no question about it. So I do believe that the US has a special responsibility in showing the way forward.
Yep.
And people look at what the US does or US firms do, and then they copy and they follow. I do think that responsibility extends from the US government to the US private sector. I think tech firms in the US should have the responsibility to perhaps be more mindful of how they handle customer data, private citizen data, perhaps be willing to sacrifice some profitability for broader social gains and invest more in society out here. So I think there is an important element of leadership, responsibility that we in the US should expect from the key players in this technology space.
Absolutely, and that government has to be the challenging force there, if you will. You know, it's interesting. I agree with you, Soumitra. The United States leads in technology. The EU leads in regulation. All right, and in an interconnected world, that means the EU ends up making rules that affect United States citizens because of the fact that the United States government has chosen to wash its hands. One example, 2 weeks after we passed the net neutrality rules, I was in London meeting with all of my counterparts from the then 28 EU countries, helping them write their net neutrality rules so that we were in sync together. That's what American leadership is all about. Then, of course, the Trump administration comes in and the first thing they do is they eliminate the rules. That's not leadership.
Well, Manish, I'm gonna put you on spot since you are from a private sector company and you guys do have a business in the US. What is your reaction to the discussion so far and the NRI results?
So I'm actually very amused because, of course, I have a view from a little bit of a distance. But to be honest, I lived about 8 years in the US, so I can feel for the US quite a bit. You know, I actually, I was thinking of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, because a lot of you come from New York, who said with great power comes great responsibility, right? And it is important that we actually learn from sometimes mythical characters as well. Excuse me. So, you know, I think that private sector has been, you know, permissionless innovating for quite some time, whether it's the US or other parts of the world. And I actually absolutely agree with you, Tom. That is tautology in their word, right? I mean, why would you even need permission for that? You know, and I'm not so much into understanding regulation, but I would say one thing, that if you look at, like you were saying, Tom, a moment ago, and Larry was also saying this, when the first technologies that we know came up, like the internet of the 1910s, ICC, it took the rest of the world 50, sometimes even 70 years to come close to it. You know, the internet, on the other hand, was, you know, in 1990 something, and I used to be in India, but by 1996, I was actually using the internet. And today, I am actually a part of a company that actually is connecting people in deep villages in India, at the same time helping with fiber connectivity in the US. I mean, I do think that an idea that came from, you know, your side of the world has transformed the world, and it's doing even more so. Yes, it's not perfect, but from this side of the ring, I actually see it as materially better. Now, of course, there could have been periods a few years ago that were even better than today and all of that. And I do think that that is a material debate, especially in this time in the US. So I wish that the US continues to show us the guiding light that it has been. But I do think that we are in a great time where the public and the private entities are working towards the absolute improvement of humanity, right? And whether there is more divide than earlier on things that didn't exist earlier, there's no question about it. But there is much more potential of the network to bring more opportunity to everyone across the world than any other technology that has preceded it. And I think that therefore, you know, honestly, we are all, you know, look, we're all looking at contributing as private sector. And it is amazing that I remember that, you know, you were mentioning about, I guess, Netscape, or the first browser that Larry showed Tom. Well, there was a time when Microsoft tried to do something which was to control every device with its own internet browser. And we are now talking about many of those companies, at least in the public domain, coming and saying, hey, we are opening up our network code for an open RAN environment, for open source in fiber to the home. So there's some amount of Spider-Man inside these powerful companies, right? They are somewhat responsible. I don't think private companies would try to lose their chance to make money. Regulation is to support them from not becoming absolutely devilish. But I do think they do have a heart, and I have a big hope for humanity overall. And that's what I would say, I guess.
Thank you, Manish. And you guys are making me feel super bad, because one of the first papers in Brazil that was written about let's not regulate the internet in the late 90s was written by me and a colleague. So, but I changed positions a long time ago, but different from the US. Brazil, at least at the time, had much stronger consumer laws. So our system, civil law, civil law, is very different from the common law in the US. But even that, thankfully, has, at least my position has changed, because not even in Brazil, where you have civil law and strong consumer protections and strong worker protections, or at least stronger than the US, those things are working anymore. So anyway, I was young. So moving forward to our next to our next commentator, Lara, I want to come to you for your comments on the NRI, but I also have, there is a question on the Q&A for you, but I'm gonna come back to that later.
Okay. So my comments on the NRI are right in theme with what we're hearing from everyone else, right? I'm a scientist, and so I look at what the US is doing in terms of innovation of future technologies, and I couldn't be anything but more excited. In healthcare, if we think about being able to move healthcare out of the doctor's office and back into the home, where we can start to get a more holistic view of an individual and understand how the choices they're making in their daily life not just impact treatment of disease, but potentially prevention, which is a thing we just absolutely ignore in our healthcare system, then technology is absolutely key to that. But I see I see two main issues. One, of course, is this question of accessibility, right? The inequalities and impact. And actually, I'll tell you that like the most exciting things I see happening in healthcare research is the creation of companies that are not trying to do cutting edge technology, but are actually logistics companies that are trying to manage nurses and doctors and tests that can be done in the home to bring that back into the system. And that's really exciting, right? Because that opens up the world. And in the world of research, it means that we're not just studying the privileged people who happen to have access to a major medical center where academic research is happening, but we can actually be studying health across our population. But the other thing I see goes right along with what everyone here is saying, which is in order to be able to start to get this wonderful utopian, maybe holistic view of health, we need to be aggregating data from many sources. And who is best positioned to be managing that data, but exactly the large companies that we're talking about here. And so, you know, I'd say in the last 10 years, what I see is data is going from being managed by individual academic centers to the large tech companies. And what are they doing with that data when they're collecting your medical records and they're collecting your Fitbit data and they have all of your search history, right? They have the ability to do the most amazing medical research in the world, but you know, for better or for worse. And so it's interesting increasingly to be thinking about how government or how policy can impact that, either through regulation or potentially through the creation of a completely separate data management system that allows us to control data outside of the large companies. And so there's increasingly talk about that. And I see that in the NRI. I see that in the indices that you're showing, that there's this need to bring these things together. And there's a couple of solutions we can use to try to address that.
Thank you, Lara. And actually related, if I don't mind, I go just to one question and then Larry, I'm gonna come back to you. So anonymous attendee actually asked, Lara, what are the policies, what policies do we need to champion on a national or international level to safeguard information sharing biomedical research across borders? So I think it's connected to what you just said.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we have to be really clear about, you know, what data we're collecting you know, in health research, in biomedical research. We need to be clear about what data we're collecting and for what purpose, right? Who's able to see it and for what purpose. And we've had a lot of blanket policies that allow blanket wide, broad positions. And, you know, I'm coming from an organization that's a nonprofit that's spent the last 10 years advocating for open data. And we have come to a place where we realize what we want is open analysis, but maybe not on open data, right? You have to be a little bit clearer about what you're going to be doing with the data, what the intention is. And that helps to go across borders as much as it helps internally as well.
Thank you so much, Lara, for that comment. Larry, can I get your reactions to the presentation and final thoughts?
I thought the presentation was fantastic. I want to commend you and Soumitra for what you've done. And I want to make sure that Manish knows that Spider-Man is from Queens, New York, which is where I grew up. So all roads lead back to Queens.
You reminded me.
Oh my gosh, it's you, Larry.
It is true. I am not Peter Parker, but it is the Spider-Man.
That's how I thought of it.
Sorry?
That's how I thought of it.
So I love this, what you've done, and I want to, I'm a data nerd, so I'm going to spend some time going through it. But the part that troubled me was the US 13th in terms of increased positive use of ICTs to society. Because the way we got started in this was thinking about how we were going to use the internet to improve the world, to improve people's lives, to make things better. And I don't want to get things twisted. We have done incredible things with the internet, and every one of us on this planet is materially better because the internet and the wireless revolution and computing technologies happened the way they did over the last 15 and 20 years. There is no doubt that we're better, and we're not going to be able to do what we need to do with the SDGs without access to this technology. And I don't remember exactly who it was. I think it was Marie who talked about inequality. I'm in Woodley Park, DC. I live a block from a school. I have a gig network into my home. There are children who have a 25/3 network, which is not quite good enough for Zoom, but is better than nothing at that same school. And then there are kids who have no internet access at all, who have zero access on any day. So on my block, there are kids who have zooming around with a gig, and then there are kids who have 25/3, which is kind of basic. And then there are other kids who have to sit outside a library or go to a Taco Bell to get access to basic education. We can do better than that. We should do better than that, and we will do better than that. But I want to go to one other point. 25, 30 years ago, no schools were connected. No libraries were connected. No police cars were connected. Museums weren't making things available to the world. The opera companies couldn't give people at home the access they have for free to see the New York Opera at a time when we're all striving and looking for information. Entities like Canopy or PBS, which give you all kinds of documentaries, didn't exist. They exist because of leadership. Tom's point, the United States government, when we started doing this internet and saying putting people first, we basically sprinkled around the planet the opportunity for people to think creatively about how they wanted to use the internet for the public good. So I helped create technologies at a little agency with $40 million. We did some things with libraries and schools, with police cars, with firemen. How could we use these technologies? And we need to think, we have AI, we have deep learning, we have the connected internet. How do we think smartly now about using these tools for public good? And it was always a public-private partnership. We've got to get back to that. And if we don't get back to that, if it's only a profit-driven motive, we're never gonna see all the benefits. And here's the beautiful thing. We've got 4 billion people connected. So imagine if we think about public-private partnerships to solve the problems of the 4 billion people connected and the 3 billion people who aren't connected, and really have a global conversation about that. The United States can lead there. And I also think that given what people may think of the United States in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, there's an opportunity for the United States. You know what? We're not just about us. And technology is not just about taking all your private data and using it for nefarious purposes. And we're not going to just surveil you. We're going to open this up and use technology, using all of our talents and all of our tools globally to really define those, to really wrestle those SDGs down to the ground and improve life for all of us rather than just some of us. I went on too long, but I remain a closet teletopian. I still believe that, Tom's heard me say this before, Caroline's heard me say this before, there is nothing wrong with the internet that can't be solved with what's right with the internet. But we've got to get about it, and we need some leadership, and we don't have that leadership today.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I do hope we have after November 3rd. So,
amen, brother.
Tom, do you want to make any comments? Otherwise, I'm just going to give the last word to Soumitra.
No, Larry is spot on.
Perfect. Thank
you. Again, as usual.
So Soumitra, I think this is more a technical question, and then please, if you could provide your last comments for us to close on the panel. Does ranking, from Jonas Bauer, does ranking imply that there is only one best practice? What if there is more than one path forward? And what if competition between different institutional regulatory market models helps the global community to innovate? This has been the case historically in telcos, seems to be happening again. Could the data be used to look at different types of best practice that reflect such diversity?
Yeah, no, so thank you, Carolina, and thank you for the question also. Rankings are imperfect exercises, as we all know them, and you can actually pick apart a ranking quite easily. So they're imperfect, yet I think they are very interesting and useful also, because they give a very quick overview of what I think are the important elements as regards the domain in a certain country or a certain theme. So I do think that these rankings do somehow capture the holistic nature of the technology discussion, technology debate in many countries. Do they capture every single best practice? No. but they do reflect areas of either good practice or poor performance. And they provide us additional indicators to go and perhaps understand in more depth what are some better practices or not so good practices in countries. And I think those are examples we can learn from. So typically you have to be able to combine the quantitative part along with a qualitative, more case-based, more in-depth analysis of specific examples. So that's really what we recommend, and that's what we've done this year too, because what we have done is combine the data part with the qualitative interviews that we have experts of the digital transformation, because there are lots of good ideas out there in the interviews which are not really necessarily captured explicitly in the data. So it's a combination of both. Now, as a final comment, what I'll just say is that clearly, I have been part of the team doing this NRI for the last almost 20 years. And I really think that the NRI or studies like this are very useful. So I have seen many countries formulate the technology policies based on frameworks like this, because what they give the policy leaders essentially is a mental framework, the mental anchor about how to think about technology. Because you can only act about a certain domain if you have a mental anchor to think about it in some intelligent fashion. So the main hope that I have out here is that NRI, with a very simple model of combining people, technology, right governance, right impact, provides a framework for business leaders, government leaders in the US, in other countries, to be able to think about technology and its impact on society in a holistic way, and to be able to take the right actions, whether it's a data agency, whether it's a platform agency, whether it's some other kinds of privacy regulations, to be able to think of the technology debate in a much more holistic fashion. And I suspect, and I argue that if we are able to take that holistic approach, we'll all be better served. So I think society will improve, and I think we'll all feel more happier in using technology and seeing technology as a part of our lives. The US in particular, I do believe that we, especially in the US, have a special responsibility out here. The same Spider-Man quote that Manish said, with responsibility, leadership comes, with power comes responsibility. So I think we should aim to lead the world, because if not, there is a real alternate choice right now. And that is more or less the China approach. And I can tell you that when you talk to many countries, especially emerging markets, they are often faced with this choice, of do I in fact adopt the sort of the US/European centric view, or do I adopt a more China centric view? And I think this is something which cannot be avoided. But at the same time, this is a real choice that many people have to make, or they will be forced to make. So I think the leadership from the US is very critical, especially if you want to help lead the world in the right direction. And this engagement of the US in the global situation and the global world, global stage, is very, very critical. And I certainly do hope that whichever administration wins and comes, in the next month or two, certainly takes that global engagement as a priority. Because if not, people are being asked or forced to make choices which may not be in the best interest.
Thank you, Soumitra. So I just want to say again, thank you to all of you for joining me today. That was an incredible panel. I knew it would be. I know some of you for longer than others, but I admire you for many years. So again, I thank you. And I just want to make sure that we take a picture. So smile for the camera. One of our RAs are taking the picture. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you have an incredible rest of your day. And soon, for the attendants who can see this video later, we're going to have a recap blog post coming with the video coming the next couple of days. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carolina.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.